The University of Pennsylvania Museum's tablet collection contains roughly 30,000 cuneiform fragments from ancient Mesopotamia. Most remain in climate-controlled storage, photographed and catalogued decades ago, but seldom pulled from their archival boxes for close examination. In 2011, a doctoral student reviewing high-resolution photographs from the Nibiru excavations noticed something peculiar about two tablet fragments from different storage boxes, fragments that had been catalogued separately in 1952 and filed under different reference numbers. The edge patterns matched. When she requested both pieces and carefully positioned them side by side under magnification, they fit perfectly. Together, they formed a nearly complete tablet, roughly 6 inches tall, written in Sumerian cuneiform, dated to approximately 2100 BCE, based on the script style and clay composition. But it was the text itself that made her hand tremble as she photographed the reconstruction. Across the center of the tablet, preserved in stark clarity, ran a phrase that appears nowhere else in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature. When the gods made war upon the gods, when brother struck brother with the fire of heaven. Not war against chaos monsters, not conflict with demons or rebellious humans, war upon themselves. Divine civil war. The tablet continues with technical descriptions that read nothing like mythology. It mentions weapons that turned stone to glass in the moment of striking. It describes a wind that brought death without wound, killing those it touched 3 days after. It names a region, possibly near where no seed would grow for 40 years after the fire descended. And then, frustratingly, a section of text becomes illegible due to damage before the fragment breaks off entirely. The rest remains lost, either destroyed millennia ago or still sitting unrecognized in storage somewhere, waiting to complete the account. This isn't a singular oddity, a scribe's imaginative flourish, or mistranslation. When you examine tablets scattered across collections from Philadelphia to London to Baghdad, fragments excavated from different cities, dating to different centuries, written in both Sumerian and Akkadian, a disturbing pattern emerges. References to councils of gods fracturing into opposing factions, detailed accounts of territorial boundaries being redrawn by force, descriptions of weapons called the brilliance that made the day dark and the night bright, lists of cities systematically destroyed, legal texts transferring authority after someone called Lord of Command can no longer perform his duties. And then, clustering around 2000 BCE, a wave of texts, unlike anything else in Mesopotamian literature, the lamentation texts, not hymns or prayers, but funeral dirges for entire civilizations. Described as given over to the wind. Uruk called a wasteland where no life dwells. The Fertile Crescent, written of in the past tense, as something that once existed but exists no longer. What if these weren't disconnected myths, composed by different cultures over different centuries? What if they were fragments scattered, damaged, mistranslated, but ultimately coherent of a single historical archive? Documentation of an escalating conflict between factions of advanced beings that climaxed in catastrophic destruction, the evidence of which was preserved by the survivors in the only medium they had, pressed clay tablets that would outlast everything else. What you're about to hear is the reconstruction of that archive. Not speculation, but a careful chronological assembly of what the tablets themselves actually say when you line them up, translate them faithfully, and read them not as religious mythology but as eyewitness historical documentation of the Annunnaki's final war. If you're settling in for this journey, whether you're drifting off in Delhi, watching the sunrise in Sydney, or walking empty streets in Seattle at 2 a.m., leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from. We're all about to follow the same trail of evidence, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago by scribes who wanted desperately to make sure someone, someday, would understand what happened when the gods went to war. Around 3,400 BCE, something extraordinary happened in southern Mesopotamia. Civilization didn't gradually evolve, it appeared, essentially complete. Within what archaeologists call a cultural blink, the Sumerians possessed a sophisticated writing system with over 600 characters, a mathematical framework based on base 60 that we still use for measuring time and circles, astronomical charts tracking planetary movements with startling accuracy, and a legal code complex enough to govern city-states of tens of thousands. This isn't how human development typically works. Writing systems evolve slowly, moving from simple pictographs to abstract symbols over centuries. Mathematics builds incrementally, each generation adding slightly more complexity. Yet, Sumerian cuneiform appears in the archaeological record already mature, capable of expressing abstract concepts, recording contracts, and documenting astronomical observations that shouldn't have been possible without generations of systematic sky-watching. The Sumerians themselves seemed aware of this anomaly. Their own records insist that knowledge came from elsewhere, handed down by the Annunaki beings they described not as spirits or metaphors but as physical administrators with specific job titles and territorial assignments. The tablets speak of those who from heaven to earth came as engineers, teachers, and governors who established the first cities as operational centers: Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, Nippur. But it's the Sumerian king list that presents the most unsettling evidence. This document, compiled from multiple sources and cross-referenced across different cities, records an unbroken line of rulers extending back into what scholars dismissively call mythological time. The list makes a clear distinction, marking a dramatic breakpoint with the phrase, "Then the flood swept over." What's remarkable is that the scribes treat both periods before and after with identical historical seriousness. Pre-flood kings are given specific reign lengths, administrative accomplishments, and genealogies, just like the post-flood rulers whose reigns we can verify through archaeological evidence. King Alulim of Eridu, the list claims, ruled for 28,800 years. King Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years. Modern scholars read these numbers as obvious mythology, symbolic rather than literal. But what if the scribes meant exactly what they wrote? What if they were recording something real but using the only measurement system they had, a calendar designed for beings who experience time very differently than the humans doing the recording? The tablets themselves offer no indication that these early entries are less historical than the later ones. To the Sumerian scribes, it was all history. All real, all part of a continuous record that began when the Anunnaki descended from the sky and established their rule on Earth. The tablets, called the Atrahasis, preserve what might be the most detailed account of a labor dispute in human history, except the laborers weren't human. They were the Igigi, the lower-ranking Anunnaki assigned to the mining operations far from the cities of Mesopotamia. For what the tablets describe as 40 periods, the exact time measurement unclear but implying generations these younger Anunnaki had been extracting minerals from deep underground work. The texts describe with remarkable specificity, digging through the hard ground, carrying the baskets, the toil crushing their backs. The location appears to have been far to the south, possibly in what we now call Southeast Africa, regions that geological surveys have since confirmed possessed some of the richest ancient gold deposits on Earth. But whatever they were mining, the Igigi had reached their breaking point. The tablets record the moment with unusual dramatic detail. During the night shift, one of the Igigi threw down his tools and began speaking words that would shatter the established order. "Every single one of us gods has declared war. The excessive toil is killing us. The work is heavy, the distress is much." The rebellion spread through the mining operations within hours. The Igigi burned their tools, abandoned their posts, and marched toward Nippur, toward Enlil's administrative center. They arrived at night, surrounding his residence, and the text records Enlil's reaction with surprising vulnerability. "What have I done to them? They have surrounded my door." He sent for Anu and Enki, calling an emergency council to address what amounted to a complete breakdown of the colonial labor system. Anu's initial response was predictable. Identify the leader and execute him. Restore order through force. But Enki posed the question that would change everything. What are we accusing them of? The work was heavy. The distress was much. Every day the earth resounded with their complaints. The tablets record his observation that the Igigi weren't rebelling against authority, they were rebelling against conditions that had become genuinely unbearable. And they were right. This is where Enki presented his controversial solution. The tablets become technical here, describing biological procedures with terminology that reads strangely modern when translated literally. Enki proposed taking a primitive hominid already present on Earth and binding upon it the image of the gods. The process involved something the texts call the essence of a god, possibly genetic material mixed, with clay possibly a metaphor for the base biological template. The result would be a hybrid, intelligent enough to understand complex tasks, strong enough to perform heavy labor, but crucially, mortal, a replacement workforce that could reproduce itself without requiring more Annunaki personnel. The council debated for what the tablets describe as an extended period. Enlil was initially opposed, seeing too many variables, too many unknowns, but faced with a collapsed mining operation and no willing workers, he eventually agreed. The tablets record the decision with bureaucratic precision. Let a Lulu be created, let him bear the yoke, let man carry the toil of the gods. They called this new being Lulu the worker. We would eventually call them human. And, according to the tablets, Enki began the process immediately, working in his facility at Eridu with the goddess Ninhursag, who supervised the biological aspects of the project. What the tablets describe next reads less like creation mythology and more like a clinical report of a genetic engineering program, complete with failed prototypes, refinement procedures, and finally, successful specimens. Enki's experiment succeeded beyond anyone's projections. The first generation of humans proved capable, adaptable, and most importantly, they reproduced without requiring Anunnaki intervention. Within what the tablets describe as 1,200 years, though whether this represents actual years or some other measurement remains debated, humanity had spread throughout Mesopotamia and beyond, establishing settlements, developing primitive agriculture, and multiplying into populations that dwarfed the few hundred Anunnaki managing them. The Atrahasis tablet records what happened next, with a phrase that has puzzled scholars for over a century. The land extended, the people multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. Most translations render the Sumerian word rigmu simply as noise or uproar, and traditional interpretations have treated this as almost comically petty, a powerful deity annoyed by loud humans. But linguistic analysis of rigmu reveals something more complex. The word appears in other contexts meaning disturbance, interference, or chaotic signal. In astronomical texts, it describes the way celestial bodies can obscure or interfere with observations. In legal documents, it refers to disputes that disrupt established order. What if Enlil's complaint wasn't about sound volume at all? Consider what humanity was actually doing during this period. The tablets describe humans developing their own languages, establishing independent settlements, creating tools and techniques the Anunnaki hadn't authorized. They were beginning to organize themselves socially, developing belief systems, making decisions without consulting their creators. Some tablets hint at humans accessing knowledge they weren't supposed to have: metallurgy, astronomy, writing systems that mirrored the cuneiform of their creators. From Enlil's perspective as Earth Commander, this represented a fundamental loss of control. Humanity had been designed as a manageable workforce, but they were evolving into something else entirely, an independent species with unpredictable behaviors and growing capabilities. The noise may have been electromagnetic in nature if the Anunnaki used technology sensitive to biological activity. It may have been cultural, the interference pattern created when millions of autonomous beings make choices that deviate from established protocols. Or it may have been something we don't have terminology for. The disturbance created when a created species begins to exceed its design parameters. The tablets indicate Enlil brought his complaint before the council repeatedly. His initial proposals were measured: reduce human populations through disease or famine, limit their access to certain regions, impose stricter controls on reproduction. But humanity adapted to each measure. They developed resistance to diseases, spread to new territories when famine struck their original settlements, and continued reproducing despite attempts at control. Enlil's frustration appears in progressively harsher language across multiple tablets from this period. In one, he declares humanity a failed experiment that must be corrected. In another, he argues that Enki's creation has exceeded its mandate and threatens the mission. The council remained divided. Enki defended his creation, arguing they were simply doing what any intelligent species would do: adapt and survive. Other Anunnaki sided with Enlil, concerned that humanity's trajectory posed genuine risks to Anunnaki operations and perhaps to the Anunnaki themselves. The debate continued for what the tablets describe as generations, until finally, Enlil proposed a solution that would require absolute secrecy, unanimous council approval, and an oath binding every Anunnaki to silence. He proposed ending the experiment entirely, not through conventional means, but through a cataclysm that would reset Earth to its pre-human state. The tablets record this decision with chilling bureaucratic precision. The gods agreed to the plan. They swore an oath concerning the destruction. The council's decision was unanimous, or at least appeared so in the official record. The tablets describe Enlil administering an oath to every member of the Anunnaki leadership, binding them to absolute secrecy. No one was to warn humanity. No one was to interfere with what was coming. The text preserves the exact wording: swear that each will keep the secret, that none will reveal to the people what is about to come upon them. Each god placed their hand upon the sacred symbols and spoke the oath, including Enki. But Enki had no intention of letting his creation perish. The Atrahasis and later Sumerian flood accounts describe what happened next with remarkable specificity, and the detail suggests these weren't moral parables but documentation of actual events. Enki couldn't violate his oath directly. The consequences within Anunnaki hierarchy for breaking a sworn pledge apparently carried severe penalties, but he was, according to every tablet that mentions him, the cleverest of the Anunnaki, and he found his loophole. In the city of Shuruppak, there lived a man named Ziusudra, called Atrahasis in Akkadian texts, Utnapishtim in later Babylonian versions, and eventually Noah in Hebrew tradition. The tablets describe him as particularly devout, someone who regularly brought offerings to Enki's temple and maintained the rituals even when other humans had grown lax in their observances. One night, Enki went to the temple, but he didn't speak to Ziusudra directly. Instead, he positioned himself near a reed wall, the woven reed partitions common in Mesopotamian architecture, and spoke to the wall itself. Reed wall, hear my words. Pay attention to my instructions. The tablets record these opening words with deliberate emphasis on who Enki was addressing. Not the man, the wall. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, seek life, reject worldly goods, save your life, bring up the seed of all living things into the boat. Behind the wall, Ziusudra listened. The text makes clear he understood immediately what was happening. Enki was speaking to an inanimate object, while a human happened to be within earshot. The god wasn't breaking his oath. He was exploiting its exact wording with the kind of technical precision you'd expect from someone the tablets consistently describe as a master of crafts and knowledge. The instructions that followed were extraordinarily detailed. Not vague guidance, but technical specifications. The boat's dimensions 120 cubits on each side, forming a perfect cube. 7 decks, divided into 9 compartments. The materials required wood sealed with bitumen inside and out. The timeline, 7 days to gather materials, 7 days to construct, and the flood would begin on the appointed day when the judge of heaven will send down the rains. Ziusudra built exactly as instructed. The tablets record that his neighbors mocked him, that local officials questioned what he was doing with so much wood and pitch, that even his own family doubted the necessity of this massive construction project. But when the appointed day arrived, the sky darkened. The text describes the flood with geological precision, not just rain, but the springs of the deep breaking open, suggesting catastrophic seismic activity combined with unprecedented rainfall. The deluge lasted 7 days and 7 nights. When the waters receded, Ziusudra's vessel came to rest on a mountain the texts call Nisir. He released birds to test whether land had appeared, and then he made the fatal mistake. From Enlil's perspective, he offered a sacrifice. The smoke rose to the heavens, and that's how the Anunnaki discovered humanity had survived. The tablets describe Enlil's reaction with language rarely used for divine beings. Enlil was furious. He raged at the assembled gods. All of us gods swore the oath. How did a human escape? How did life survive? The council turned to Enki, the only one capable of such precise deception. And Enki didn't deny it. He argued his case. Humanity deserved to exist. The punishment was disproportionate, and erasing them entirely was wasteful after so much effort in their creation. The tablets record a compromise reached under duress. Humanity would survive, but in limited capacity, shorter lifespans, reduced populations, and permanent separation from certain knowledge and territories. But the damage to Anunnaki unity was irreparable. Enlil and Enki, the two primary administrators of Earth, were now operating in fundamental opposition. The trust within the council had shattered, and according to the tablets, this fracture would continue to widen over the following centuries, setting the stage for conflicts that would eventually consume everything the Anunnaki had built. Across multiple Mesopotamian texts spanning different periods and languages, one object appears repeatedly at the center of conflicts among the Anunnaki: the Tablet of Destinies. Traditional scholarship treats it as a metaphorical symbol of divine authority, but the tablets themselves describe it with the kind of functional specificity usually reserved for technological devices rather than symbolic objects. The Sumerian term Dupshimati translates literally as Tablet of Destinies or Tablet of Fates, but the descriptions of what it actually did suggest something far more concrete than a symbolic list of predetermined events. Texts describe it as conferring supreme power, granting control over the me, the Sumerian term for the fundamental organizing principles of civilization. Whoever possessed the tablet could issue commands that other Anunnaki were compelled to obey. It determined the fate of all things. But in context, this appears to mean control over Anunnaki operations and infrastructure rather than mystical predetermination. The most detailed account of its theft appears in the myth of Anzu. Though calling it a myth does the text a disservice, it reads more like an incident report. Anzu, described as a subordinate Anunnaki with bird-like characteristics, possibly a title or role designation rather than a physical description, served in Enlil's inner chamber. The text specifies he had access to Enlil's private quarters, where the tablet was kept. One day, while Enlil was performing ritual ablutions, Anzu seized the tablet and fled to a remote mountain region. What happened next reveals the tablet's true function. With it in his possession, Anzu could apparently disrupt or override Anunnaki command structures. The text described the me becoming confused, authority breaking down, and normal operations grinding to a halt. Enlil couldn't simply issue an order for Anzu's arrest. The command structure had been compromised. Instead, he had to appeal to individual Anunnaki to volunteer for what amounted to a military recovery operation. Several refused. The texts preserve their reasoning. Confronting someone who possessed the tablet was extraordinarily dangerous. Finally, Ninurta, Enlil's son, and the Anunnaki military commander accepted the mission. The account of the battle is surprisingly tactical. Ninurta couldn't approach directly because Anzu could see him coming and counter any attack, suggesting the tablet provided surveillance or defensive capabilities. Ninurta had to devise a strategy involving simultaneous strikes that overwhelmed whatever protection the tablet provided. When he succeeded, recovering the tablet and returning it to Enlil, the texts describe order being restored and the me functioning properly again. But the tablet's vulnerability had been exposed. If one subordinate could seize it and disrupt the entire Anunnaki hierarchy, it was a systemic weakness. The texts from the following period show increased security measures, multiple references to the tablet being sealed or secured, and Enlil apparently keeping it on his person rather than stored in chambers. Yet it was stolen again. The Epic of Era, which describes events much closer to the final war period, records another seizure of the Tablet of Destinies, this time by Era, also called Nergal, the Anunnaki administrator of the underworld territories. The circumstances are less clear, but the consequences were catastrophic. Era's possession of the tablet coincides with what the texts describe as a breakdown in territorial boundaries, challenges to Enlil's authority, and ultimately, the deployment of weapons that would devastate the region. Modern analysis of the tablet's descriptions suggests it may have been a control interface for Anunnaki infrastructure communication networks, defensive systems, perhaps even the me themselves, if those were actual devices rather than abstract concepts. In a hierarchical system dependent on centralized control, such a device would be indispensable. Its possession meant legitimate authority. Its theft meant systemic chaos, and its repeated seizures during conflicts suggest it wasn't just symbolic, it was the key to operating whatever technology the Anunnaki had established throughout their Mesopotamian territories. The pattern is unmistakable across the texts. Every major conflict among the Anunnaki involves either the tablet's theft, its defense, or disputes over who should control it. It was simultaneously the symbol and mechanism of power, and in the years leading up to the final war, control over the tablet had become increasingly contested, increasingly violent, and increasingly desperate. The text known as Inanna's Descent to the Underworld has been interpreted for over a century as a seasonal myth, a symbolic journey of death and rebirth representing agricultural cycles. But read alongside the political and territorial texts from the same period, it takes on a drastically different character, that of a diplomatic crisis that nearly shattered what remained of Anunnaki unity. Inanna, administrator of Uruk and one of the most powerful Anunnaki, decided to visit the underworld domain, the southern territories controlled by her sister, Ereshkigal. The tablets are explicit that this wasn't a casual visit. Inanna arrived, demanding entry, wearing all her regalia of office, accompanied by her attendant Ninshubur, and claiming the right to attend funeral rites for Ereshkigal's husband Gugalana. But the text suggests her true motivation was more territorial, possibly attempting to extend her influence into regions where she had no legitimate authority. Ereshkigal's response reveals this wasn't merely a family dispute. She ordered her chief administrator Neti to allow Inanna through the 7 gates of the underworld, but to strip away one piece of her regalia at each gate: her crown, her measuring rod, her lapis necklace, her breastplate, her ring. Each item represented not jewelry but insignia of authority. By the time Inanna reached the throne room, she stood before her sister, stripped of all marks of power, effectively a prisoner in hostile territory. What happened next, the tablets record with stark brutality. Ereshkigal and the 7 judges of the underworld passed judgment on Inanna for her transgression. She was struck down. The text uses terminology suggesting execution rather than mystical death, and her corpse was hung on a hook as a warning. The tablets specify 3 days and 3 nights, an unusual level of temporal precision for supposedly mythological events. In Uruk, when Inanna failed to return, Ninshubur followed the emergency protocols Inanna had established before her departure. She went to Enlil seeking intervention. He refused, stating that Inanna had gone to a place she should not have gone. She went to Nana, the moon god. He also refused. Finally, she appealed to Enki, who could never resist a problem requiring clever solutions. Enki created two beings. The texts describe them as neither male nor female, possibly constructs or specialized operatives, and sent them into the underworld with specific instructions. They successfully retrieved Inanna's body and revived her using what the tablets call the water of life and the food of life, substances Enki apparently had access to. But her return came with conditions imposed by underworld law. Someone had to take her place. The crisis didn't end with Inanna's resurrection. It escalated. Territorial boundaries that had been carefully maintained for generations had been violated. Ereshkigal's authority had been undermined by Enki's intervention. The careful balance of power between different Annunaki factions had been disrupted. The tablets from the period immediately following describe increased tensions, challenges to established territorial agreements, and what one text calls the gods no longer respecting the boundaries drawn by Enlil. Inanna's transgression and her successful escape from its consequences through Enki's intervention demonstrated that the old rules no longer held. If territorial boundaries could be violated, if judgments could be overturned, if authority could be challenged without permanent consequences, then the entire system Enlil had maintained was fundamentally compromised. The tablets suggest this incident marked a turning point, after which conflicts among the Anunnaki were no longer resolved through councils and compromise, but through increasingly direct confrontation. Around 2000 BCE, something catastrophic happened across Mesopotamia. The archaeological record shows major Sumerian cities suddenly abandoned within a narrow time frame. Population centers that had thrived for over a millennium were left empty, their inhabitants either dead or fled. The explanations offered by conventional scholarship, economic collapse, climate change, invasion, struggle to account for the speed and completeness of the devastation, but the texts from this period offer a different explanation, one that's been dismissed as hyperbolic mythology until you read the descriptions carefully. The Epic of Era is not a creation myth or a moral fable. It's a chronological account of systematic destruction. Era, also called Nergal, controller of the underworld territories, is described as deploying what the text calls the 7 weapons of brilliance. The descriptions don't match conventional Bronze Age warfare. These weapons make the land like fire. They turn day to darkness, and they create a storm that brings death without wound. One passage describes light so intense it burns the eyes of those who look upon it. Another mentions a wind that kills days after exposure, suggesting radiation or chemical contamination rather than conventional weapons. The text is geographically specific. The cities of the plain Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Shuruppak are mentioned by name as primary targets. The weapons are described as descending from above, striking with precision, and leaving devastation that persists long after the initial attack. One fragment mentions fire that fell from heaven and consumed the flesh of the living. Another describes water sources becoming poison and land turning white as salt. The lamentation texts that follow read like systematic damage assessments. The lamentation over describes the city in past tense as something that once existed. The people groan, the city is destroyed, the houses are in ruins. Is given over to the wind, its people are scattered like grain. The lamentation over Sumer and provides even more disturbing detail. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm that wears away the land, covered like a cloth. On that day, the storm forced people to live in darkness. In the countryside, the plants were scorched, the orchards were stripped bare. Archaeological surveys of the region reveal patterns consistent with these descriptions. Excavations at show a layer of abandonment around 2000 BCE with no signs of conventional siege or gradual decline, just sudden depopulation. Similarly, Sites throughout southern Mesopotamia show evidence of rapid abandonment during this period. Some locations show unusual geological signatures, vitrified pottery fragments, anomalous radiation readings in soil samples, and blast pattern distributions that some researchers have found difficult to explain through natural causes. The texts indicate the weapons were deployed by one faction of Anunnaki against territories controlled by opposing factions. But the contamination spread beyond intended targets. The evil wind, mentioned repeatedly in the Lamentations, moved across the region, poisoning lands that hadn't been directly struck. The tablets describe survivors fleeing north, abandoning everything, describing skies that remained dark and air that burned to breathe. What's remarkable is that the texts don't describe this as divine punishment for human sins, the traditional interpretation. They describe it as warfare among the gods themselves that humanity simply got caught in the middle of. The lamentation over Nippur explicitly states, "The gods abandoned their cities. The gods of Sumer and Akkad could no longer dwell in their sanctuaries. Not divine judgment, divine retreat." The weapons deployed were so devastating that even those who wielded them could no longer inhabit the territory they'd fought over. After the weapons fell silent and the evil wind dispersed, the Anunnaki simply left. The tablets don't describe a grand farewell or promises of return. They describe abandonment. Cities that had served as administrative centers for thousands of years stood empty of their divine occupants. The carefully maintained hierarchies, the councils, the territorial divisions, all of it dissolved within what appears to be a single generation. The tablets, from the period immediately following, are striking in their tone. They no longer address the gods as present administrators who might respond to appeals. Instead, they speak of the gods in past tense, describing what they once did, where they once lived, how things once functioned when they were still here. The transition from direct divine rule to human self-governance wasn't gradual. It was abrupt, traumatic, and left survivors scrambling to maintain systems they'd never been trained to operate independently. What emerged in the wake of the Anunnaki departure was a culture defined by anxious observation. Mesopotamian civilization after 2000 BCE became obsessed with omens, celestial phenomena, and the interpretation of signs to a degree that seems pathological until you understand the context. They were watching the sky not out of religious devotion but out of trauma. These were people whose gods had waged war with weapons that turned cities to ash, who had then departed, leaving no clear indication whether they might return and what they might do if they did. The elaborate systems of astrology, the meticulous tracking of planetary movements, the interpretation of every unusual celestial event as potentially significant. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were surveillance protocols maintained by a civilization that had witnessed technological capabilities far beyond their comprehension and lived in perpetual uncertainty about whether those capabilities might be deployed again. Every unusual light in the sky, every comet, every eclipse was scrutinized for signs that the Anunnaki might be returning, or that the fire from heaven might fall again. The cuneiform tablets themselves take on different significance when viewed through this lens. They weren't religious texts meant to inspire worship. They were historical records, carefully preserved accounts of what had happened during the age when humanity lived under direct control of beings with advanced capabilities. The scribes who copied and recopied these texts across generations weren't transmitting mythology. They were maintaining an archive, a warning system for future generations about what had come before and what might come again. The tablets describe the arrival of the Anunnaki, their hierarchies and territories, the creation of humanity as a labor solution, the conflicts that emerged, the escalating tensions, and finally the devastating war that ended their presence on Earth. Read chronologically, they form a coherent historical narrative of colonial administration, labor disputes, factional conflicts, and eventually catastrophic warfare followed by withdrawal. We inherited a planet scarred by conflicts we didn't start, administered by systems we didn't design, and ultimately abandoned by beings who left us alone to either thrive or destroy ourselves with the knowledge they'd inadvertently shared. The tablets remain, pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, still waiting in museum storage and archaeological sites across Mesopotamia, still carrying their warning about what happened when the gods went to war. The heavens have been silent ever since. Whether that silence represents abandonment or simply a very long pause, the tablets don't say. They only record what was, and leave us to watch the skies and wonder what might come next.